Welcome back to Classical Christian Thought. I'm your host, Erick Ybarra, and I am joined today by a returning guest, Dr. Ed Echeverria. How are you doing, Dr. Ed?
I'm fine. Just busy with some classes, and I'm actually working. I'm on the final stages of another book. I have a 3-volume work coming out.
Whoa.
And part of that is, in this book, Jesus Christ, Scandal of Particularity, Vatican II, Catholic Theology of Religion, Justification, and Truth. In the preface to the book, I actually quote Karl Rahner, who in his volume 1 of his theological investigations, in the preface, he tells us that, the number of specialist journals of theology, he said, is gradually becoming incalculable. And this was in the 1951.
Mm.
And then he says, the result is that essays which appear in them tend rather to be hidden than to be published, So nobody reads them.
Right.
Naturally, he says, it's not the business of the author to judge whether the obscurity into which these essays fall is a just fate or a regrettable misfortune, he says. But if he has the right to make anything appear at all, he cannot be reproached for trying to publish his work in some other form which will make it more probable that someone will read it. So all of the essays in this book on Jesus Christ, Scandal of Particularity were previously published in Nova et Vetra, in the Journal of Josephinum Journal of Theology, in the Angelicum, and so on. And so obviously I had to sort of put them all together and knit a kind of a coherent narrative. So this 3-volume work that I'm working on, it's called, the book as such is called Redeeming Creation, and volume 1 is Redeeming Sex, the Battle for the Body. So I'm working on that. And again, essays that not like the first chapter is a new chapter, but most of the essays in the book are have already been published. And then volume 2, that's going to be, I don't even know how my publisher is going to do that, because there are like 20 essays that I've published over a period of 20 years.
Wow.
And they've stood the test of time. And so that's called Redeeming Reason, Faith, Rationality, and Truth. And then the 3rd volume is going to be called Redeeming Culture, Christ, a Sign of Contradiction. So I'm finishing with the first volume, which, it'll be out sometime in early 2025. But in any case, this book is also, as I said, a collection of essays, two chapters 1 and 2, where I deal with the late Australian theologian Gerald O'Collins, Jesuit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I deal with a lot of things. I mean, I deal with interreligious dialogue, the nature of interreligious dialogue, and that it's truth oriented. I say to people in the subtitle, justification and truth. Justification, it's not about, I'm not talking there about
soteriology.
No, it's not a soteriological notion. It's an epistemological notion that you have to be able to provide a justification of the beliefs that you hold to be true, so that if you're engaged in interreligious dialogue, yes, of course, you can bring the full content of Christian commitment to bear on the dialogue, and you're interested in understanding, the way Ratzinger put it, the otherness of the other in his own thinking and that sort of thing. But then he says, Benedict says, that's very superficial in the end, because you have to be able to provide a justification as to why you're not a Muslim, why you're not a Buddhist, a Hindu, and so on. And since the conversation already begins with the understanding that there are competing and conflicting truth claims here,
Right.
That's fundamental to the discussion, because the question of disagreement is, in the end, I say, really a question about truth, you see,
Sure.
and justification. And that's too often missed. We'll come back to that because I think it's missed by Francis. And
Yeah. Well, for the viewers, Dr. Ed is I believe you're retired professor.
no,
No?
I'm not retired. I will never
Okay.
retire.
Okay.
And,
I thought you were retired, but still active in some capacity.
no,
But
no,
okay.
I'm still full-time at professor of philosophy and systematic theology at Sacred Heart Major Seminary, the Archdiocesan Seminary of Detroit. So, no, I always say I like getting paid every 2 weeks. So now, of course, the drag about when you get to be 70, I'm 74. When you get to be 70, you have to sign up for Social Security. And if so you get your Social Security, but if you're employed, they're going to tax you on Social Security. So I'm hoping that Trump's no more taxes on Social Security.
That's unreal. That's unreal.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, so the listeners, you're watching you're tuning in. The title of this is the Particularity and the Exclusivity of Jesus Christ. The title of the book presents this as the scandal of particularity. And so tell us a little bit about what brought this book on. And I'm assuming that this is not a book with articles that were hidden from the eyes of man.
No,
This
no,
was
they
you
were all
wrote.
published. They were all published. Like,
Yeah.
the first chapter wasn't published because in the first chapter, I tried to give an account of the theological status of the proposition that Christ is the full and sufficient means of salvation. You see,
Right.
Dominus Jesus, what Dominus Jesus argues. But the remaining chapters, chapter where I discuss the issues raised by the late Father O'Collins. Let me just focus there for a moment. You see, Father O'Collins is what I call an inclusive pluralist. Yes, he thinks that he would agree that Christ is the full and sufficient means of salvation, but then he thinks that these other religions somehow, in a subordinate way, participate in the mediatorship of Christ. You see, and so in his view, it's not my view, but in his view, you can be saved as a Buddhist, not despite Buddhism, but because of Buddhism. You see, and I argue against that. Because it seems to me like for instance, if you go to Lumen Gentium, Dogmatic Constitution on the Church, and at the end of paragraph 13, yes, it says God calls all men to salvation in grace. So there's the calling, and so that means if you ask the question, did Christ die for all men? Yes, the question is yes. But that doesn't mean, so the work of Christ is sufficient for the salvation of all men, but that doesn't mean that it's efficacious, because you have to participate, as Trent says, as Aquinas says, you have to participate in the saving benefits of the cross in order to be saved. Father O'Collins, his understanding of special revelation, remember he rejects the distinction between general and special revelation. General revelation being God's revelation of himself in and through the works of creation. What we find in Romans 1, what we find in Romans 2, and also in the Acts of the Apostles, where Paul says that God has not left himself without witness, and so on. But in his mind, special revelation is so comprehensive that it embraces all religions. All religions are actually vehicles of God's special revelation, you see. And so that's why he rejects, and he claims that Vatican II does that, but that's just not true. Vatican II doesn't reject general revelation, nor does it reject the distinction between general and special revelation. Special revelation being historical, verbal, constitutive of the history of redemption, and also it's salvific. General revelation is not salvific, even if there are elements of truth and goodness, because God has not left himself without witness. So you can pick up the Quran, let's say, and read, the witness of God in those texts. Here's another aspect that many people ignore, and that is that the reception of that general revelation is distorted. It can be, even if it's there, it can be distorted. It can be, in the end, rejected. For instance, I always give the example of the Muslim Islamic theology, which confesses or professes to believe in the God who is one. There's some debate about translation there, whether Vatican II in Lumen Gentium or Nostra Aetate was saying that the Muslim believes in the one God, or whether he believes in the God who is one. Regardless, if he believes the God who is one, when you begin to probe his understanding of oneness is such, he's a Unitarian. So there can be no unity and diversity in the Godhead. God can exist in solitude for him. So even though we can begin a conversation where we understand that we both confess that God is one, that doesn't mean in the end that we agree as to how they predicate that oneness.
Yeah, so, especially when they use so natural revelation can be used by non-Christians to refute Christianity. Right.
Yes, they can. Yes, because general revelation is something that is in principle accessible through natural reason. That's what Vatican I, 1869, 1870, it says that God has made his existence from St. Paul, from Romans 1, through the things that he has made.
Right.
Through the things that he has made. And so you can find there evidence. But theologians like the late Father O'Collins, they reject the distinction between general and special, because they want to argue that all revelation is salvific. All revelation is salvific. In fact, I discuss in my book his, what he talks about it in his book on Vatican II and other religions. But even he wrote a smaller book called, after that, he wrote a smaller book called the Christology of Religions. The Christology of Religions. And the Christology of Religions has to do with, where Nostra Aetate talks about, Nostra Aetate, refers us to the Gospel of John, the first chapter, the light that Christ, that all men are somehow exposed to the Christological light. In Nostra Aetate too, which speaks of those things in other religions that are true and holy and reflect the ray of that truth which enlightens all human beings.
Yes.
People like Father, he's dead, so we'll cut him a little slack here. But in any case, he ignores the fact that the word does not illuminate all human beings because they resist the light. Consider John 1, 5, and 10. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. So he has very, if any, he acknowledges, but it doesn't play a part in his theology of religions. The presence of sin and evil, that human reception to general revelation, and even to the Christ-centered light that is referred to in the Gospel of John in the opening verses, that the human reception of that light is open to resistance, and hence the distortion misinterpretation, and rejection ultimately. There's a point where I actually there are many. I try to interpret this, and I cite many biblical theologians. So in him was the life, and the life was the light of all men, in John 1:4. And so throughout the book, he cites, this is on page 138 of my book, he cites Nostra Aetate, paragraph 2, which speaks of those things in other religions that are true and holy, as I said a moment ago, and reflect the ray of that truth which enlightens all human beings. Now, as I already said, O'Collins ignores that the human reception of that light is open to resistance and hence to distortion, misinterpretation, and rejection. And I cite all kinds of people, but he doesn't distinguish the offer of salvation or being called to salvation by God's grace, which is one thing, and the actuality of reception of that grace. That's another matter. And I cite all kinds of theologians, the great Reformed biblical theologian Ridderbos and the Methodist biblical theologian Ben Worthington III. But I also cite the Catholic biblical theologian, the German Rudolf Schnackenberg. You've heard of Rudolf Schnackenberg, who in his commentary on the Gospel of John in Volume 1, he says, the Logos was not just a fundamental and universal principle of light in the divine plan. He also illumined the existence and way of man from within the historical reality of man's environmental world. He was in the world, so close to men that they could reach him and cleave to him for their salvation. But the world, that is humanity, installed in its earthly historical home, did not know him, he says. That is the brutal and shattering fact, says Schnackenberg, which to him signals in a few short words and reiterates more poignantly in the following verse, in verse 11. Thus the hymn pursues of set purpose the thought of the second strophe, the relationship of the Logos to mankind, but depicts the tragic breach in the historical course of the relationship. You see, he has no, and many don't. That's why the Christology of religions, they love citing that passage from John, 1:4.
Right.
But again, they overlook that the human reception of that light is open to resistance and hence to distortion, misinterpretation, and rejection. Put differently, he overlooks the place of sin that is at the root of man's resistance. And this results, of course, in a salvation optimism, a mentality that slides from the proper emphasis of Vatican II, as Ralph Martin puts it in his book, Will Many Be Saved?, regarding the possibility of some being saved without hearing the gospel, to the probability or even certainty that all or almost all will be saved without hearing the gospel. Now, people like Father O'Collins, they think that you can be saved not in spite of Buddhism or Hinduism, but because of it, you see. And that makes him, as I said, an inclusive pluralist. I think you have to distinguish two things. You have to distinguish between the sufficiency of Christ's atoning work and its efficacy. And then you also have to ask the question, which I think, what is it, in Lumen Gentium 13, all men are part of, Christ died for all men. So all men are called to salvation by the grace of God, prevenient grace. But that doesn't mean that they're all saved, because they have to, it's not automatic. You have to participate in the saving benefits of the cross. And so that's why in paragraph 14, it goes on to say that faith, baptism, and the church are necessary for salvation.
Right.
And then in paragraph 15, it talks about non-Catholics. But then in paragraph 16, it talks about non-Christians. Now, Jews, I think, are in a different category for the church. At least the Pontifical Council Why is this coming up here?
No, I'm going to share that after you make your point.
Okay, the Pontifical Council for the for interreligious dialogue. It doesn't include Jews, Israel. They belong to another group, the Christian, the religious. I forget what term they use, but religious organization of Jews and of Catholics and Jews. You see, but in its most recent document about 4 or 5 years ago, it makes very clear that there are not two tracks of salvation, Israel and the church. There's only one track. Christ is the full and sufficient cause of our salvation. Huh? It's again the particularity of Jesus, of his salvific particularity, and on the other hand, all those other religions are put in the category of invincibly ignorant. Those who, through no fault of their own, have failed to respond to the gospel. So here's where I say you need to distinguish. You need to ask this question: can you be saved apart from the works of Christ? And the church says no. No, you can't. Can you be saved apart from explicitly responding to the works of Christ? Possibly. Not probably, and certainly not certainly, but possibly. So I defend the position that sometimes I call accessibilism, such that you can have access. You can have access to God's saving grace in Christ, not because of Buddhism and Hinduism or any of those religions. I sometimes use a term that Paul Helm, who's an English.
He's reformed, right?
Yeah, he's reformed. Yeah, and he talks about, which I think is a good term, and I think it's a term that fits Gaudium et Spes 22. But he talks about opaque exclusivism. We don't know. We don't know. But what we do know is that salvation is in Christ alone. In Christ alone. And if a person is saved, it's in spite of the religion that he belongs to, not because of the religion. This is another area of disagreement with Father O'Collins, because he wanted to argue, remember, because he has this special revelation. He rejects the distinction between general and special, and so he thinks every manifestation of God's revelation is going to be special. And so I discussed that also in the chapter on Dei Verbum, chapter 3, where I'm discussing this Belgian Catholic theologian who's interpreting Dei Verbum in a way that rejects, again, the distinction between general and special revelation. And so special revelation is so comprehensive that, because revelation is not propositional, you see. It's all, there's no revealed truth as such, you see. It's all dialogical. And right. so God has, dialogues. And also you have this idea, because special revelation is so comprehensive that all religions are salvific. And so you have also this idea, remember St. Paul in Acts 17, where he talks about
the altar to the unknown God.
Yes, but also where he says at the end they're groping, and so the church maintains the distinction between general and special revelation, and that revelation is historical. It's a verbal revelation, and it's a salvific revelation, and hence we're responding to that revelation, as opposed to thinking that we're just groping to find to give expression as because that's a distinction. John Paul II makes that distinction in his apostolic letter that he wrote, just as a kind of a preface to the 2000, and he makes that distinction, and it's a distinction that comes from Congar and many others, where Christianity there's a revelation, and men are responding to that revelation, as opposed to the idea of we're just simply in search of who God is. You see?
Yeah, I wanted to share one of the famous portions of Scripture where Christ commissions Paul, because this speaks directly to what you were saying, the distinction between natural and special revelation. So this is in Acts chapter 26. You'll recall when Jesus comes to Paul and basically commissions him to the work of the gospel. He says in verse 16 of Acts 26, "But rise and stand upon thy feet, for I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make thee a minister and a witness both of these things which thou hast seen and of the things which I will appear unto thee, delivering thee from the people and from the Gentiles, unto whom I now send thee." And this is what Jesus says he plans Paul to do: to open their eyes,
Right.
to turn them from darkness
Right.
to light, and from the power of Satan unto God, that they may receive the forgiveness of sins and inheritance among them who are saints.
Right.
So in other words, Jesus sees the very logic of the mission is to deliver. It's a deliverance.
Right.
Mission. And so if the people are already open and exposed to the light of God, they're already walking in the light, they're already walking in the power of God in small participations.
Right.
That's not how Jesus would have confronted the situation.
No.
He's setting out a mission into the darkness to call people out of it.
Well, and that's why too often theologians like Father O'Collins and others, they seem to think that men already possess the light.
That's right.
And the only thing is to make it explicit, you see. But that's just not the way the New Testament thinks of, as you said, from those passages and others in the New Testament. There has to be a response. There has to be an act of conversion. Many other places, Paul says, the mind is darkened and so on. Now, that's all true, and I agree 100%. But there's also the witness of general revelation. It's like the example I give is Plato and Aristotle, for instance. They're pagans, and they think about the world in a thoroughly false framework as pagans. But that doesn't mean that they don't make true claims about human beings, and about even good and evil, and about God. But of course, those claims that they make have to be transformed. They have to be transfigured, as it were, transposed from that context into the Christian faith, so that there can be change. Aquinas says in his commentary on De Trinitate, on Boethius' De Trinitate, he says about the relationship between theology or doctrine and philosophy. He says it's not like just taking something over and incorporating it into your system, into your theological system. It's like water being transformed into wine, he says. Water being, and so that's the thing. I mean, you read these, you read Plato and Aristotle, or you read whoever in the non-Christian context, and they seem to be making true claims, because I don't think we can say that there's no. Well, we can't say that God has left himself, that as if there's no witness in those other religions of God's revelation. Now, of course, we have to be careful there and not interpret that to mean to deny what the verses that you read, or to deny that faith involves conversion, transformation. That it's not just you're already enlightened, but you're just trying to make that explicit. That seems to me to be completely wrong, because you are, in fact, you're a fallen human being. You have to be transformed by the blood of Christ, and so on. But even in that context, we still the mind. That's a point, of course, the church has always made, because St. Paul makes it. It's made, in Vatican I, in De Filius. It's made by John Paul II in Fides et Ratio, that the mind can grasp certain truths about God. Otherwise, there would be no natural theology. There would be no way to argue. We'd be fideist. We would be fideist, and we'd think that in fact there is no witness of God in his general revelation in these other religions. So I think we have to maintain that distinction between general and special. I think we have to be able to say, okay, God has not left himself without witness, but of course that doesn't mean that these other religions are somehow salvific or participate, like Father O'Connell. Remember, I said he's an inclusive pluralist.
Sure.
No.
But how does this play into what Pope Francis said to the Singaporeans, though? Because he said that, he's rhetorically saying, is it true that your God and your truth is more important than mine or my God? And he basically asked the crowd, can we really say that? Is that true? And they all go, no. And he affirms it. And he says, okay, you understand, because there is one God, and all the religions, like languages, are different. Camino, plural for camino.
I'm sorry to say that he's confused. He's confused. It's one thing to say, as we've been saying, that God has not left himself without witness, and so that we can find elements of truth and goodness in these other religions.
Right.
But when you begin to explore these other religions, like as I said earlier, when we begin to explore how the Muslim predicates oneness in God, we discover that their understanding of oneness is completely incompatible with the understanding of oneness that we have as Christians, because they are Unitarians. They think that God can exist in solitude. We're Trinitarians, so we think that there's unity and diversity in the Godhead. They explicitly reject that. So they
call us heretics for that.
That we're heretics. As you begin the conversation, you see, here it is. Yes. So Francis says, and I discussed that at length in this book, but also in my Pope Francis book, the second edition. Yes, we begin interreligious dialogue. We begin with the full content of Christian commitment. We begin with the aim of trying to understand the otherness of the other in his own thinking, as Benedict would say. But those two principles are superficial, says Benedict, because and you see, I think Francis doesn't recognize this. There are competing truth claims in the conversation. So the fact is, disagreement between the religions is really a disagreement about truth. It's a disagreement about justification. Now, I was not surprised that Francis said this, because he doesn't, I often cite, and of course the naysayers and those that defend Francis regarding everything he says, they don't seem to understand that Francis actually says several times, he says, to dialogue means to believe that the other has something worthwhile to say and to entertain his or her point of view and perspective. Engaging in dialogue does not mean renouncing our own ideas and traditions, but the renouncing, these are his words, the renouncing of the claim that they alone are valid or absolute. That they alone are valid or absolute. What could that possibly mean? What could that possibly mean? So, in the conversation that he had in the 4th of September 2013 with that atheist who's dead now, Eugenio Scalfari, he was a journalist of the Italian newspaper La Repubblica, and one of his questions to Francis asked whether there, quote, is no absolute and therefore no absolute truth, but only a series of relative and subjective truths. Now, I won't get into the whole thing, but just a crucial response that Francis gives. He says, to begin with, says Francis, I would not speak about absolute truths, even for believers, he says, in the sense that absolute is that which is disconnected and bereft of all relationship. Truth, according to the Christian faith, is the love of God for us in Jesus Christ. Therefore, truth is a relationship. Now, just in parentheses, I go on to discuss truth itself is not a relationship. The knowledge of truth is a relationship because it involves the question regarding the conditions under which I come to know that something is true. But truth itself,
it's a propositional claim.
It's a propositional claim. And for something to be true, that means that what is asserted is in fact the case about objective reality. So that's an objective truth. As such, Francis continues, each one of us receives the truth and expresses it from within. That is to say, according to one's own circumstances, culture, and situation in life. This does not mean that truth is variable and subjective, quite the contrary, but it does signify that it comes to us always and only as a way of life and as a way and a life.
See, he tries to save himself from the pluralistic effect.
Right.
But by what he just said about the relational essence of truth, it puts it into the sphere of the dialogical, where things can't be competitive between one claim and another.
Exactly.
I'm not sure he recognizes
No, I don't think he understands what he's saying. I go on to distinguish. You have to distinguish between the conditions under which I come to know that something is true, and those conditions may very well, they're epistemic conditions. They may very well involve making claims from a social, cultural, historical, and ecclesial location in life. But you have to distinguish that, the matter of the conditions under which I come to know that something is true, from the conditions that make it true.
Yes.
The condition that make it true. The question whether the statement is in fact true. And since religious dialogue from the beginning involves competing and conflicting truth claims, you have to acknowledge that. I often say to my students, if the central claims of Christianity are true, then Islam is false.
Right.
Islam is false. And so, you see, he won't say that.
No, because for him, it's caught in the sphere of relation.
That's right. That's right. And so everybody has a differing relation with respect to the truth. But at the end of the day, it just seems to me, this is where, Francis, I did have a symposium on my book a couple of months back. And oh my goodness, I had Ralph Martin and Dan Keating, and also I thought I'd take a chance, and I asked Bob Fastigi, you see.
Oh, wow.
I won't even tell you on camera what.
Okay.
But there was no. I said, how does one interpret this statement where Francis tells us that we have to renounce the claim that they alone are valid or absolute? He doesn't want to renounce our own ideas, but the fact is, later on in my Francis book, I said, one of Francis's first principles, I like, Evangelii Gaudium. I think there were many good things in that book. I think over time, in my judgment, he's gotten worse. But one of his first principles was that reality is greater than ideas. But this idea, taken seriously, that reality is greater than ideas, is itself an idea. It's self-refuting, because it's only through ideas and concepts and words that we can apprehend the meaning of reality at all, or know that it is greater than ideas. Now,
this is why he can say all the religions are pathways to God, because it's all in God. God reconfigures himself to each person.
Right. And these are just ideas, you see. And so I then say at one point, I said, the first point, there's a particular question arises here that Francis doesn't address, but which is crucial to understanding the truth status of dogmatic formulations. Are the truths of faith expressed in the creedal statements of Nicaea and Chalcedon, more particularly orthodoxy, just ideas, mere theory, mere thoughts, or mere sets of words, altogether separate from God? Or do they convey or grasp divine reality itself, the truth about that reality fulfilling the truth-attaining capacity of the human mind to lay hold of divine reality? If in fact you begin the conversation understanding that, as a Christian, that you hold certain beliefs, that the belief content of faith, the fides quae creditur, the belief content involves propositions, assertions that you're making about divine reality. And if you understand that there are these competing truth claims, I think that Francis suffers from what Ratzinger called in his introduction to Dominus Jesus in 2000. He talked about the ideology of dialogue, the ideology of dialogue. And I think he suffers from that, so that his such as it is, his epistemology, yes, we don't need to get rid of our ideas, but our ideas for him don't really involve reality, don't really involve making claims about reality. And so, as I say, I wasn't surprised that he said that. Or even the idea where, earlier on in that Abu whatever, with that Muslim, Abu Dhabi, where he said that God wills the
diversity of all religions.
Yes, I know, and I talk about that in my book. That Bishop Schneider pushed him on that, and then the Pope distinguished between God's permissive will and his decretal will and all that. But the fact is, he didn't change. He didn't rewrite that, and so people still get this idea. And here's one last thing here, and that is that religious diversity is really a matter of disagreement, and disagreement here is really a matter of truth and justification. But also, John Paul II in his address that he gave, laying out the sort of theology behind his view of Assisi, he puts he distinguishes between creation, fall, redemption, and religious diversity belongs to the order of the fall. It doesn't belong to the order of the origin. No, it belongs to the order of the fall, where you have competing and conflicting truth claims, he says. So I just think he, I know that there, I always say to myself, who would have thought that I would say this about the Pope and so on? But the fact is, it's all confusion to me, and it's leading people astray. And then of course you have those folk. Yes, like this guy he appointed, the successor of Cantalamessa. I sent something to.
Oh yes, I know.
I don't remember his name, but then Lykoudis, tries to, because there was some pushback, some criticism, that it seemed as if he was supporting, the legitimacy of homosexuality and homosexual identity and so on, and then he quoted, I don't know where Bob had written this. But then that's why I posted that business that Ratzinger had already in '86 made problematic the distinction between condition and inclination and act and all of that.
His father, Roberto Pasolini.
Yeah. And then of course I sent it to what's his name, Pedro Gabriel, who I like. But he sent me that recent, was it an encyclical, the encyclical that Francis wrote on the Sacred Heart of Jesus and all that, as if somehow that helps us. No, because one of the things we know about Francis is that he can say something that we can somehow agree with and think, okay, and then his actions are in, his pastoral actions are in conflict with that. Look at all the, the photos with Father not Francis Martin, but Father James Martin and all these people, intersex. He took that photo with intersex and
the monk under Bishop Stowe.
Yeah. Oh, come on now. You want to meet with those people? Meet with them in private. Do you have to? What does it say to us when you're taking photos?
Right, and this is not like people who are marginalized and are looking for hope, like when Jesus would reach out to the marginalized. These are people who for years have had financially supported efforts to reconfigure the gospel.
Right.
These are people, it would be like Arius making his yearly visit to Rome to take a picture with the Pope.
Right.
It's like it gets to the point where there are no defenses for it.
I agree with you, but of course there are all these people who I've had questions from this group of people who then say to me, your salvation is in jeopardy here because you're questioning the Pope, and so on and so on.
It's amazing. It's amazing how rigorous they become when it is a matter related to obedience to the Pope. But for all the things that the Pope think are not that big of a deal, there is no urgency anymore. All of a sudden, the urgency to leave Hinduism is not there in Pope.
No, there's no that because the Pope. I still remember that time when there were these nuns. I forget where the Pope might have been in Brazil. The Pope and these nuns said that these people came into the church, and the Pope chastised them. He chastised them as if somehow there was something wrong with the urgency to evangelize or whatever. These are so. I just think. This is why, for me, this book is one of the reasons why this book is important, because it addresses the question that interreligious dialogue is truth-oriented. It addresses the question that when you're engaged in dialogue, you begin by recognizing that there are these competing and conflicting truth claims among the religions, that you recognize that that sin is also an epistemological condition that affects the way we receive the light of Christ and the light of general revelation and so on, and also that that you have to be able to at some point say, well, if Christianity is true, I'm going to tell you why I'm a Christian. And if Christianity is true, and these are my reasons for being a Christian, these are the reasons why I'm not. These are the reasons why I'm not a Buddhist, or I'm not a Muslim, or even why I'm not a Jew, because the church doesn't say that there are two tracks, Israel and the church. Remember, I said in that document, it says explicitly that there's only one Savior.
We have a question from.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah.
Well, how can we make a judgment if what Pope Francis said is material or formal heresy? Well, to talk about heresy means that he actually understands, whether material or formal, that he actually understands what he's saying. I don't know if he has, if he really understands what he's saying, because, remember in the conversation that he had with Bishop Schneider, he tried to backtrack and say, no, I'm not saying all religions, are the will of God. I'm just saying that God's permissive will is such. So I don't, honestly, I would have to, given what he's written, I think it is problematic. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
Given his presuppositions about truth and about justification, about conflicting truth claims. I say at one point in chapter 5, where I'm discussing Fratelli Tutti, I say missing, however, in Francis' view, is that truth claims embedded in cultural formations may also be opposed dialectically. In other words, what for one is true, for another is false. What for one is good, for another is evil. You're not going to find him saying that. What this means is that incompatible truth claims cannot just be, this is something he does say, differing reflections of the inexhaustible richness of human life, as Francis claims. Hence, he overlooks the question of incompatible truth claims, not only in interreligious dialogue, but also in cross-cultural dialogue.
Yeah, everything gets absorbed. One way or the other, everything gets absorbed.
Right. And so affirming some truth claim excludes that state of affairs which would render the proposition false. So if you affirm that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, that excludes a state of affairs in which would render that proposition false. And it would render that proposition false if you thought that that revelation is so rich, special revelation is so rich that it's everywhere. I quote Keith Ward. If he says, if an assertion excludes nothing, it affirms nothing.
Right.
In that sense, all truth claims are necessarily exclusive. When Paul says that there's only one mediator between God and man, that's an exclusive claim. When Peter says in the Acts of the Apostles that there's no name other than the name of Jesus by which men can be saved, that's an exclusive truth claim. When Jesus himself says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no man cometh to the Father except through me, well, that's not only an exclusive truth claim, but it's particular because it's Christ who is the way to the Father. Keith Ward says, since this is a matter of logical possibility, it is a necessary truth that not all possible interpretations can be equally true, authentic, or valid. Now, I think Francis ignores this necessary and hence non-negotiable truth in order to affirm the coexistence of diverse perspectives locally and cross-culturally.
Yeah.
Now, there are all kinds of people who try to then, I've had conversations, oh, you don't understand what Francis means when he says that we have to withdraw our, absolute truth claims. Well, I say, well, tell me what you think he means.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. These commentators, they overlook the significance of his incoherence, and they paint the coherence on top of it.
Right.
They make a coherent case for him by using an alien concept, what they think he really means deep down inside.
Right. But they don't talk about. I always say, well, this is what he says. This is what he says. He says, I don't speak of absolute truth. This is what he says. How are you going to deal with that claim? How are you going to deal with that claim? It's one thing to say, okay, to sort of posit a kind of apophaticism. You can find apophaticism at the core of even of Vatican I and certainly Vatican II, and that is that there's always more to know.
Yeah. I'll finish your point, but we have somebody who sent in a question.
Okay. But we can know something truly, definitively, determinately, even if we don't know it exhaustively. So throughout the centuries, books have been written on the Trinity, on the Incarnation, on the atoning work of Christ, trying to deepen our understanding. But I always say, don't be seduced by the dark side of the force, I say. When someone says to you, but you have to be humble. Well, I think there's epistemic humility. Epistemic humility is that there's always more to know. But whatever it is that you know has to be consistent with what you already know to be the case.
Right.
You can't conclude from your raising questions, let's say, about the fate of the unevangelized. You can't conclude from that therefore, there are many paths to God. No. Yes, it's a genuine question. What about the fate of the unevangelized? But it seems to me, so epistemic humility has nothing to do, and that's why I say don't be seduced by the dark side of the force, because I've heard people talk about, you have to be epistemically humble and all that. But in their minds, that means that you can't know anything to be determinately true, period. But the fact is, Jesus is the Word made flesh. Well, and that's, you can put a period after that. Does that mean that I understand right now everything that there is to understand about the Incarnation? No. But you can know something truly, determinately, without claiming to know it exhaustively. But whatever it is that you come to know more deeply has to be consistent with what you already know to be the case.
Thank you. Yeah, Colin Gordon, he asked, can you please give us your top 3 books, preferably older, on the concept of natural religion?
Well,
what about Ratzinger's Truth and Tolerance?
Truth and Tolerance. So is he asking me to name books that I've written, or just books
that you recommend?
Oh, books. Well, yeah.
If you've written, if you want to plug in your books, feel free.
Well, I would certainly plug in the book that we've been talking about, Jesus Christ, Scandal of Particularity, right. Vatican II, a Catholic Theology of Religions, Justification and Truth. I would recommend also my book, the second edition of my book on Pope Francis, The Legacy of Vatican II, Pope Francis, The Legacy of Vatican II. I would recommend also my book that I wrote in 2017 called Revelation, History, and Truth. A Hermeneutics of Dogma, that was published by Peter Lang Publishers. The book on Francis was published by Lexio Publishing. And then the one that we've been talking about was published by, what's his name? It was published by En Route Books and Media, St. Louis, Missouri. En Route Books and Media.
Yeah, here's the front cover, folks. Jesus Christ, Scandal of Particularity, Vatican II, A Catholic Theology of Religions, Justification, and Truth. And again, justification here is not soteriological, but epistemological.
That's right. And just one last thing, and that is that, in my view, Vatican II doesn't teach any of what, even though Francis often says, I'm just teaching straight Vatican II. No, that's just not the case. I think Vatican II teaches, this guy asks, is Karl Rahner the key to understanding Pope Francis' comments on other religions? Yes, I suppose, but I suppose he is in some way, if you're talking about, but Francis doesn't really, he's not
I don't think Karl Rahner would be saying some of the things that Pope Francis.
No, I agree with you. And I think there are many things in Karl Rahner that I like. He drank the Kool-Aid around 1970, but before that, volumes 1 and 2 of his theological investigations, I think his discussion of doctrinal development is in my view, excellent.
Yeah, he also had a good essay on primacy and the episcopate.
Right. That, and then also his. They're just, and the same thing with. I discussed Lonergan rather than.
Bernard Lonergan was.
I discussed
that's another guy I would recommend.
Yes, but he's also confused. He at some point in method and theology and early Lonergan. His book on the Trinity is
that's the one, systematic.
It's very, very good. But he also drank the Kool-Aid at some point, But look, at the core of this is holding on to affirming that Jesus Christ is the full and sufficient means of our salvation. And in that sense is the scandal of particularity, but also the exclusive source of salvation. Ontologically, yes, you can go on to ask the question, distinguishing between those two questions. Can you be saved apart from the works of Christ? The answer is no. Can you be saved apart from explicitly responding to the works of Christ? There, I think Vatican II is talking about the invincibly ignorant in Lumen Gentium 16, those who through no fault of their own have failed to respond to the gospel. And it affirms some kind of accessibilism, that you may have access, not apart from grace. It's a prevenient grace, but there's still, as I said, following Paul Helm, there's still an opaque exclusivism there, because you're not saved because of these other religions. You're saved in spite of them. In paragraph 16 of Lumen Gentium ends by telling us, woe to us, according to St. Paul, if we do not preach the gospel, because even though God's prevenient grace is made available, very often, it says in the third paragraph of 16, men resist the grace of God. And then it refers us to Romans 1:18 and following. And then it says, hence, we need to evangelize. We need to proclaim the gospel. That's a transitional passage to 17, which talks about evangelization. And then that's preparing us for the declaration ad gentes, which has to do with the permanent validity of the church's missionary mandate. If the church thought that you could be saved by being a good Buddhist or a good Hindu, etc., or even for that matter, a good Jew, there would be no need to talk about the missionary mandate of the church. And remember, John Paul II in 1991 published his encyclical Redemptoris Missio, the mission of the Redeemer, and which had the title, in the English, it had the title on the permanent validity of the church's missionary mandate. And in the fourth paragraph of that encyclical, he asked the question whether evangelizing has been supplanted by by interreligious dialogue? And he says no. And then he asks the question, which presupposes, what is the chief end of man? And of course, the chief end of man is not this worldly. It's to enter into the life of the Trinity, beatitude, and so on. And so, of course, evangelization, you're calling men to respond to the gospel, conversion. And then, of course, he goes on to talk about how some people think that the church's missionary mandate has been rendered redundant, unnecessary because of religious freedom. This is just nonsense. And then also the question of conscience, So,
yeah, I get the feeling that with Pope Francis, we are seeing some of what was clearly wrong in the minds of the average Catholic theologian from the 70s being put into the mainstream.
Right.
I get that feeling because
yeah,
you read all these works from the early, pre-Vatican II, just after Vatican II, and they're talking about this, like they're talking against these ideas where the dam is about to be broken,
mm-hmm.
and they're trying to protect the exclusivity of the faith, but you've got all these speculative theologians coming out,
Right.
and I feel like Pope Francis has basically put a stamp of approval on a lot of what was shunned.
His view, in my judgment, and I know that there are people out there, the explainers will say, oh, how can you say this? But it seems to me his view, as he expresses it, cannot justify and safeguard, the exclusivity of Christ, the scandal of particularity. He may say that, but then when he's in another context, sort of working it out, it's undermined. And it's undermined, as I said, because of his view of, his epistemology, his denial that you can know absolute truth and that we have to renounce absolute truth claims, and his failure to make all kinds of distinctions, and the idea that somehow dogmatic, the true status of dogmatic formulations are such that they're just ideas or mere words, or so orthodoxy. So are these just mere words, mere ideas, just thoughts? All of these things, it seems to me, yeah, you can try to provide some kind of account of these things, but he doesn't provide. And also the fact that he diminishes the significance of the fides quae creditur, the content of faith. It's experiential. It's fides qua creditur. It's the faith as it's experienced, as it's lived, not as it is asserted. Not as it is asserted, or propositions, truth, or all that. Sometimes I've written where I say sometimes Francis sounds to me like, there's Aquinas who raises the question in the second part of the Summa, in questions in the first question, and where he sort of is addressing the opposition that's raised between God and propositions. And he rejects that. He thinks propositional knowledge of God is necessary because we're making assertions, because belief involves thinking with assent, he says, and we're assenting to the true status of propositions. And so, yes, of course, God is more than a proposition, of course, but the fact is, we have to be able to make assertions about God. If we don't, this is where Ratzinger in Truth and Tolerance says, this is where people try to create a space for interreligious prayer, you see, because none of the claims of these religions actually refer to God. They're all penultimate, he says. And of course, he rejects that. Because
it's very concerning.
It is very concerning. I agree with you. And there's not much to say.
Yeah, there's not much to say. I mean, it's kind of like what what do we do when we see Peter denying Christ? We pray for his conversion, just
You
like
pray for
Jesus
his
did.
conversion.
Jesus prayed, Jesus prayed for his conversion. Obviously, there's a unique sense in how, there's an infallible prayer. For us, we don't do any good to try to cover over these things and reinterpret everything. And
They
to
don't want
pretend
to.
like
They
there's
don't
no
want to
problem.
acknowledge cognitive dissonance. They don't want to acknowledge cognitive dissonance.
Right. And
That's what it comes
these
down.
are not dumb people.
No, they're not dumb. No,
Yeah,
they're not dumb people. But they don't want to acknowledge cognitive dissonance.
right.
They
It's an
treat
issue
the
of the
Pope.
will.
They treat the Pope as if he's an absolute monarch,
Yeah.
and so that everything that comes out of his mouth is somehow going to be. We have to affirm it.
Yeah.
Or as if he somehow is changing our perspective on things. And no, in the first edition of my Francis book, I tried to. This sounds arrogant, but I tried to save Francis by putting him in the context of Vatican II and John Paul II and Benedict and all that. But then by the time several years, that was published in 2015. But then after a few years,
Morris Letizia came out.
Oh, Morris Letizia and all other kind of things. It was, in my view, it was just unsavable. His thought, his thinking, anyway. I probably.
All right, we're getting past an hour here. I think we got a lot out.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, we got a lot out. I'll put the book in the show notes so everybody can get to that link.
Thanks very much, and let me know when you actually post it.
Yep, I'll definitely. No, this will be posted immediately, so you can share. I'll send you the link. You can share it with everybody.
All right, thanks a lot, Eric. Always a pleasure, and your generosity and having these conversations.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Always a pleasure to have you.
All right, thanks a lot.
We'll do it again soon.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, when my book on redeeming sex, the battle for the Bible comes out.
Yep, for sure.
Okay, man. Take care, brother.